Hello and welcome back. Let's take a look at the thinking question from the last lesson. When do you think it is most important for you to be able to understand place value? For me, I think it's most important to be able to understand it when you go to purchase a really big thing like a car. A car is going to be in the higher place values, and you're going to have to be able to understand what the different numbers mean. Also, if you're purchasing a house, you're going to have to understand what the larger place values mean so that you know what you're really buying and what you're really getting into with the cost. I think it's also really important to understand place value when we're talking about statistics. So just like I mentioned in the last one, when we're talking about populations of places, when we're talking about how many people have gotten the flu this year, when we talk about how many people have had babies in the last year, we're going to need to be able to understand the larger numbers and understand what we're really talking about. So just like I said in the last lesson, today we're going to be talking about decimals. We're going to be talking about place value to the thousandths place. Hopefully you did learn about that in 4th grade, but you may not have, and that's okay. We'll go over it today. What you're going to need today is a paper and pencil, absolutely. And again, a calculator is optional, highly recommended. If you have one on your computer, use that. So pause your video and go gather your materials. So let's get started. The first thing that you need to know about decimals is something that you probably have learned before. And that's that numbers aren't always quite what they seem. Up here we have 3 nines. Normally 3 nines would be a really big number. That would be 999. But we have this sneaky decimal point right here. And that sneaky little decimal point changes everything. It makes it so that this 999 represents less than 1, which is a lot less than 999. So anytime we're talking about decimals, we're talking about a number that is less than 1. It is less than a whole, less than 1. Now, hopefully you remember from the last video that when we were finding the place values going from the ones to the tens to the hundreds to the thousands to the 10,000s, 100,000s, and so on, each place value you just had to multiply by 10. Well, we can do the same thing with decimals. But now we're going from the ones place, we're going to the right instead of going to the left. So what that means is that we have to do the opposite of multiplication, which is division. So you have to, in order to find the next place value, when you go to the right, or you go towards the decimal place, you're going to have to divide by 10 because it's 10 less than if you went the other way where it would be 10 more. So we're going to take a closer look at that today. Here we have our place values that are greater than 1. So we have our ones, our tens, and our hundreds. We're pretty familiar with this, so we can fill this out pretty easily. You know the hundreds looks like this. Now, I'm going to show you how this division thing works with place values you already know and understand, and then when we look at the decimals, it'll make a little bit more sense. So, I put in 100 into my calculator. If you have your calculator, follow along. So 100 divided by 10, because the next place value to the right is 10 less. And look, I have 10. So that's my next place value. Now, going from my tens to my ones, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to do 10 divided by 10, because it's going to be 10 less, and that's going to equal 1. That's exactly what I thought it would equal, and I was right. So let's carry that then over to the decimal place. So let's carry that then over to our decimal place. So if we take our 1 and divide it by 10 to find the next place value, you get 0.1. That is less than 1. It is 10 times less than 1. And that is our next place value. And we're going to have a decimal point right here. That is our tenths. There are 10 tenths in our whole. Because then if we went the opposite way and we said 0.1 times 10, we would get 1. In fact, let's try that. We have 0.1 times 10 equals 1. So just like when we go in the opposite direction, we see that it still works. When we multiply by 10, we get the next place value to the left. Now, something else you may have noticed is that just as before when we were multiplying and we were adding a 0 each time that we added a place value, now we're subtracting a place value. So we went from 100, 2 zeros, to 10, 1 0, to 1, 0 zeros, then to tenths. We've now moved our 0 over here. So let's see if we can get to our next place value. We're going to do 0.1 divided by 10 equals 0.01. And that's going to be our hundredths place value. Now, something that I really want you to notice here is how these are spelled. There's a TH in both of them. That TH is kind of important. Actually, it's really important because that's what tells us the difference between the tens and the hundreds, the tenths and the thousandths. So the way we write this is 0.01. So now we just took away another 0, kind of. I mean, we still have to write it, but we're getting, it's one more 0 away from the whole. Now we're going to take a look at what this actually looks like because it can be confusing and doesn't necessarily make sense until you see it. So we're saying that this blue square is our 1. I'm going to drag it over this hundredths grid to help me out. So this is my 1. This is a hole. Remember, when it's over here, it's a hole. Now I'm dragging it over the hundredths grid so that you can see that we can break a hole into a whole bunch of pieces. In fact, we've broken this one into 100 pieces. That means that I can find a decimal of it because it's now broken up into pieces. Now, what would 1/10 of this blue flat, this blue square be? It would be 10 of these squares because, look, there are 10 of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that means this yellow long represents 1/10. 1/10. That would be one way to write it. 1/10 would be another way to write it. And 1/10 would be another way to write it. This would be the decimal way to write it because that tells me that 1 out of 10, if I broke my whole into 10 pieces, I have 1 out of the 10. I don't have the whole because I just have this. I have 1 out of the 10. That's 1/10, 1/10, 1/10. It's not a whole. We don't have the whole thing. We just have that 1/10 of it. Now let's look at the next place value. Our next place value, if you remember, is our hundredths place value. That means we have to break our whole up into 100 pieces, which it's done. That's what each of these little squares represents. And if I cover one of them, that represents 1/100. That covers 1 out of 100 pieces that makes up the whole. So I would write that like this. 1/100th. Or 1/100th, 1 out of 100. Or as a decimal, 0.01, because this is my hundredths place value, and that tells me how many out of 100 I have. Now, let's just take a second to pause and think about this for a minute. Which one is larger, the tenths or the hundredths? Pause your video and think about that. The tenths are larger. It takes up more of the whole. It represents more of the whole. This is a lot more of our whole, 1/10, than our 100th. It's a lot more. It's 10 times more, in fact. I'm going to put a picture up on the board that shows a blue flat that is broken up into 100 pieces, and then there are some longs and some tenths and some hundredths that are covering it, and together we're going to try to write the decimal to represent it. So let's look first, how many holes do I have? Remember, this is my hole. How many holes do I have that are completely covered? I don't have any. So that means I have 0 holes, 0 ones. Now our next place value is our tenths. How many tenths do I have covered? 1, 2, 3. 3 tenths. So I'm going to put a 3 in my tenths place. Now how many hundredths do I have covered? 1, 2. I have 2 hundredths, so I'm going to write a 2 in my hundredths place. That tells me that I have 32 out of 100 that are covered. 32 pieces out of the 100 are covered. It's not a hole. We don't have a complete square or 1. We have 32 pieces out of the 100 that make up that hole. Let's do another one together. How many holes do we have? Pause your video and write down how many holes we have. We have 0 holes, so we're going to put a 0. Now pause your video and write down how many tenths we have. I put my decimal point and then a 0 because I don't have any tenths. Just like it's important when we're talking about whole numbers like ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on. Just like it's important with those numbers to have placeholders when you don't have a number in a certain place value, it's just as important when we're talking about decimals. Because if I wrote the hundredths here, then that would be saying a completely different thing than me putting a 0 here. So now pause your video and count how many hundredths we have. We have 8 hundredths. So that tells me that we have 8 out of the 100 pieces that make up our whole that are covered. Great job so far. We're going to do an even trickier problem now. I'm going to have you compare 2 decimals to decide which one is larger. We'll do that by looking at what they look like. So 0.06 or 6 hundredths. We're going to represent that with either these little blocks or with our longs. Pause your video and write down on your paper which one we're going to represent 6 hundredths with. We're going to represent it with these little ones because each of these represents 1 100th. So we're going to put 6 of them on here because we have 6 100ths. And then over here, our number says 6 tenths. So now we're going to put 6 of these up because each of these represents 1/10 of our whole. And there you have it, 6 tenths. So which number is larger, 6 hundredths or 6 tenths? 6 tenths is definitely larger. You're going to try some of these on your own now. I'm going to put up a couple of different pictures that represent different decimals, and you are going to write down what the decimals are on your paper. There's going to be 4 of them, so number your paper 1 through 4. Pause the video and do that now. Okay, so your paper should have numbers 1 through 4 on it. And the first 2 that you're going to do are right here. So here's number 1 and here's number 2. So you're going to write down what decimal each of these represents. When you have finished those 2, unpause the video or resume the video and then wait for the next 2 to show up and then work on those. This first one, number 1, is going to be 0.12345 So there's 6 tenths and 5 hundredths. So it's 65 hundredths. And I'm going to read that 65 hundredths because I read this as if it were its own number, and then I say the name of the last place value. So the last place value is the hundredths, so I say 65 hundredths. Now this one, before I give you the answer, I'd like you to whisper to yourself how you would say that number. Okay, so it's going to be 0 because we don't have any holes, and then I have 2 tenths, and I don't have any hundredths, so I can just stop there. So I read this 2 tenths because my last place value is the tenths. For the next two, I have 0 wholes. I don't have any tenths either, so I'm going to put a 0 there as well. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 hundredths. So I'm going to put a 4 in my hundredths place. And now try and read that number to yourself. Just whisper it. It would be 4 hundredths because that's the last place value that I have. Now this last one over here. Again, I don't have any wholes. Then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 tenths and 3 hundredths. Read that number to yourself. It's 0 and 93 hundredths. Great job. Pause your video and try this. Remember, these blue squares count as our 1. They're our whole. So first we're going to look at how many holes we have. We have 1, 2, 3. This does not count as a whole because the whole thing is not covered. So I have 3 holes. How many tenths? 4. And how many hundredths? 9. Whisper to yourself how you would read that number. It's 3 and 49 hundredths. 3 and 49 hundredths. Great job. So we're going to try some word problems now. And I said earlier that the whole can be virtually anything. It doesn't have to be just that big blue square that we were using. It can also be a pizza. It could be a classroom full of kids. It could be a school. It could be virtually anything. So here, we're going to look at a word problem that says you're planting a garden with a variety of vegetables. You split the garden up into 10 equal sections and then decide which vegetables will go in which sections. You decide that carrots will go in 2 of the sections, tomatoes will go in 3 of the sections, squash will get 1 section, and peas will get 4 sections. What decimal represents the amount of space the carrots will take up? Pause your video now and try to figure out what decimal of the garden, which the garden is our whole, the whole garden is the whole, the 1. What decimal of that space will the carrots take up? Here's a picture that I drew to represent the garden. And I split it up into 10 sections because it says that there are 10 equal sections. And then I put the different vegetables in each one to represent it. So I noticed that I have carrots in 2 of those sections, just like the word problem told me. That means I have 2 out of 10. 2 tenths. That sounds familiar. I can write that as a decimal, 0.2. That's 2 tenths. It's taking up 2 sections out of the 10. The next word problem says Frank decides to run a 100-mile race. Ooh, that's long. He wants to make sure he has a water break when he has completed 25 hundredths of the race, as well as when he has completed 5 tenths and 9 tenths. At what mile in the race should he place his water bottle to have a water break 9 tenths of the way through? So pause the video and try to solve that now. He's going to have that water break at 90 miles. And the reason for that is 9 tenths of the way through. So we know it's going to be 9 out of 10. Or if I were to draw the race, if I were to draw it as if it were our big blue square and split it up into 100 pieces, then it would be 9 tenths, so 9 longs. It would be 9 tenths of the way through. And so I know that I can count this as 10 miles, 20 miles, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and then it'll be at the 90-mile mark because that was 9 tenths of the way through. If you weren't really that comfortable with decimals after this lesson, or if you think that you could use some extra practice reading and writing and working with decimals, then I would encourage you to watch the extra practice lesson. If not, you can just go on to lesson 3. The thinking question at the end of this lesson that I'm about to give you isn't going to be answered until lesson 3. So if you skip the extra practice lesson, then you don't have to worry about missing a thinking question. So here's your thinking question. Why do you think we need decimals and what makes them important? So think about that. I'll read it one more time. Why do you think that we need decimals? What makes them important? Great job today. You worked with a lot of different numbers. It's a tricky concept, but you did really well. Bye.